Hello and welcome to Rao's IAS DNS session. We are going to have a discussion on today's newspaper, The Hindu, Delhi. Before we start with the discussion, there's two quick announcements. You have a little more than 5 months in your hand for the coming prelims exam. And it's right time you polish, get sharpened with your skills and aptitude to take the prelims test. If you haven't had enough practice, I would recommend please take the well-crafted test of Rao's IAS for prelims exam. Apart from that, there's also an announcement for PSIR optional test series. There are 16 tests in the test series, and you know that before prelims exam, you have to go through one full test series of your optional and GS. So take the time of December and January. If your optional is PSIR, join the test series, get the feedback, learn, fill the gaps, and then take another test series after prelims, which will bring you on the line ready to go. This article is from page number 7 of today's The Hindu. Bihar's prohibition policy is not working. Prohibition is an act or the policy of the government of forbidding something by law. But more particularly, the term prohibition is used in the context of regulation, banning the manufacture, storage, transportation, sale, consumption of alcoholic beverages. The state of Bihar imposed complete prohibition in the state in 2016, drawing its inspiration from Article 47 of Indian Constitution. Article 47 directs the state to endeavor to bring about prohibition of the consumption except for medical purposes of intoxicating drinks and of drugs which are injurious to health. Also, you must note that alcohol as a subject has been mentioned in the state list in the 7th schedule. So, the state governments have all the power to regulate the consumption of alcohol and also to ban its consumption. But various reports have come up criticizing the policy of prohibition of the state of Bihar. Even recently, the ex-Chief Justice of India, Justice Ramanna, he also criticized the policy for lacking foresight. We'll try and analyze the prohibition law of Bihar in a manner and the way that the template can be used in other analysis of other policies as well. First of all, when the government comes with a law, it must do legislative impact assessment. Just like we have the concept of environmental impact assessment, in many of the European countries, they have committees that do legislative impact assessment as well. It is not enough that the law is well crafted and it is well intentioned. You must also know what impact the law will bring on the state, on the machinery of the state, on the economy, society, polity, environment, etc. It is one of the axioms of governance that any policy with political, social, economic, or any other value ought to be first examined in the scale of implementability. What is not implementable may not be operationalized despite the nobility of the cause, despite the purest of the intention. And it is criticized that the state of Bihar failed to apply this simple test in the present instance. So when law is still at the formulation stage, you have to see what effect the law will have. For instance, what is the impact on judiciary? The former Chief Justice of India, Justice N.V. Ramanna, he said that the state's prohibition law lacked foresight. The consequence was inundating of courts with liquor-related cases. The prohibition law in Bihar is said to overburden the state's judicial administration. There has been lakhs of prohibition cases and bail applications clogging the district courts and Patna High Court. Then you must also see what is going to be the social impact. The State Crime Record Bureau data suggests that there has been rise in crimes. There has been emergence of new kind of crimes like bootlegging by juveniles and even by some other villagers, politicians, cops. They all are now be used to supply the liquor. The Patna High Court has observed that there have been very few cases registered against the linchpins of liquor cartels. An overwhelming majority of the cases are on poor people who have been caught drinking. So clearly, these social impacts were unthought of. The legislation was not well thought through before enactment. It also must be seen that the new legislation, how it is going to impact the fundamental rights that already has been guaranteed and concretized by the recent judgments of Supreme Court. Any invasion by the state in any individual rights to choice of food, beverages, all these amounts to an unreasonable restriction and destroys the individual's decisional and bodily autonomy. It comes in conflict with right to privacy. Right to privacy has been well declared as a fundamental right in the Puttaswamy judgment. It also has to be seen in the context of various judgments of Supreme Court where it has been declared that Part 3 and Part 4 of our Constitution, the fundamental rights and DPSP, they have to be harmoniously construed. In the beginning, I told you that the prohibition law was inspired by Article 47. This is part of DPSP. And now we are saying that it is coming in conflict with right to privacy. It is part of fundamental right, Part 3. It was also said by the Supreme Court in Minerva Mill versus Union of India case that the goal under Part 4 could not be pursued at the cost of infringing fundamental rights. However, no such discussion went on while the bill was being discussed, or any analysis of the bill on these aspects were not done by any expert committee. We also have a very important concept of counterintuitive behavior. Generally, what happens, law has one intention to direct the behavior of citizens in a particular manner. But the actual result is the exact opposite. For example, initially when the seat belts were introduced, the intention was to reduce road accidents. But in fact, this led to more accidents. But such things are counterintuitive for the lawmakers. It's difficult to comprehend the exact opposite impact of the law. See, people respond to incentives. So the introduction of seatbelts gave driver a false sense of security. And what else is, it also got them to drive recklessly. As a result, even though there was a slight decrease in driver's death, there was dramatic increase in the pedestrian death. Hence the result, overall, the death toll rose. But who could have thought of that? There's a very famous case law of the New York City introducing soda tax. The New York government introduced a soda tax to cut soda purchases, which ultimately leads to obesity. But what they didn't realize was that increasing prices for people who wish to satisfy their sugar requirement would push them to shift to substitutes. And after the introduction of soda tax, there were many reports to show that even though the soda sales fell, the purchase of sugar and other sugar products increased. And obesity still remained the challenge for the city. Scotland has done experiment with liquor ban way back in 1853. It legislated Forbes-Mackenzie Act of 1853. The act tried to cut down the alcohol consumption by closing Scotland's pub at 11 p.m. on weekdays and shutting it down all day on Sundays. Hundreds of licensed drinking establishments were closed. But the thing is, they were only to be replaced by shebeens, the illegal drinking centers, they call it shebeens. Shebeens offered cheap, adulterated, often dangerous alcohol. But they learned their lesson and they repealed the act. United States, they brought prohibition in 1920. But immediately after that, the authorities reported increased consumption of adulterated alcohol. There was sharp increase in the crime as well. The court and the prison system, they were unbearably strained. Large number of people were jailed and prison expenditure went through the roof. In 1929, the Assistant Attorney General reported that alcohol was anyways available everywhere at almost any hour of the day or night. And the ban, it closed down the brewing industry, leading to substantial job losses. The country lost around 11 billion US dollar in tax revenues and it spent additional $300 million on enforcement. The Commission on Law Observance and Enforcement reported in 1931 that there was widespread police and political corruption. And soon enough, in 1933, they abandoned the prohibition. Bihar is placed exactly the same as the past example, but failing to learn the lesson. According to the Bihar police crime data, the cognizable offense rose by 13% in the first 6 months after the prohibition was imposed. The courts are crippled, corruption is rising, new form of corruption of bootlegging by teenagers is emerging. The impact of legislation has not been as it was thought of, or rather imagined of, because obviously proper thought process was not involved. So when the government comes up with new law or policy, or when you have to do the analysis of it, you must do the analysis based on at least these parameters for legislative impact assessment. And you must also analyze whether the infrastructure and the supporting mechanism exist for the legislative implementation. For instance, border management. How well the state will be able to manage its border. And what also you have to see, and you must also analyze whether the infrastructure, that the states share its border with Nepal, West Bengal, Jharkhand and Uttar Pradesh. And none of these states practice prohibition. And there are evidence that the liquor is flowing into the state from the neighboring states like West Bengal and Jharkhand because these states have seen phenomenal rise in their excise revenue. The same is the case with Gujarat. Prohibition is not effective because of porous border from Daman. In Daman, there is no prohibition. So the porous border and administrative complicity makes the Gujarat prohibition ineffective. The state must also look at its own fiscal health. This realization dawned on Haryana pretty fast. Haryana gave up its attempt at prohibition due to its inability to control illicit distillation and bootlegging. Tamil Nadu and Kerala similarly ventured to ban liquor but abandoned it because they failed in the implementation. Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Manipur, they all overturned prohibition after they failed in execution. We have a more sane example from Maharashtra. Maharashtra imposed prohibition in 2015 in the district of Chandrapur, but they withdrew it in 2021. Prohibition was not imposed in the entire state, it was imposed in the state of Chandrapur. But based on official statistics gathered from various government departments and even from the collector's report, it has been documented that the prohibition was a failure. After prohibition, the sale of liquor went up, large quantities of illicit and spurious liquors were started to circulate. There was a thriving black market. The state government lost the revenue despite rise in liquor consumption in liquor trade. The money was now going to black market and private hands. There was marked increase in the criminal cases registered, and what's worse, women and children, they started getting involved in the illicit liquor trade. So the district's social, health and economic parameters became worse in 5 years of prohibition. So they learned the lesson, and in 2021 the prohibition was called off. The state must also look at its fiscal health. Bihar already figures among the fiscally most vulnerable state in the country, but it chose to forego a large chunk of revenue being imposed by prohibition, by imposing prohibition. This is what the critiques of prohibition argues. It is also said that sometimes the idea is right. It is noble, benevolent, compassionate, but the time isn't right for it. Why don't we implement universal basic income? Why don't we make the health and education absolutely free? At least for the vulnerable section. That is why ex-CGI Justice Ramanna said that the legislation lacked foresight. Critique says that apart from moral satisfaction of legally cleansing society of what is perceived as a social evil, there is nothing that the state has got to show as an accomplishment by prohibition. So what should we be doing? It is universally agreed that women-led community-based approaches, they work better. The problem must be dealt socially. There must be informed and constructive dialogue on causes and effect of drinking habits. Social movements and educational institutions have to be more participative to highlight the harmful effect of drinking habits. And laws rather must be framed to encourage responsible behavior and compliance. For example, drinking age should be uniform across the country and no person below the drinking age should be allowed to buy alcohol. The laws must be made against the drunken behavior in public or domestic violence under the influence of alcohol and drinking and driving, so that even if it is not eliminated, the harmful social impact of drinking, at least that can be managed. And you do things that you do for other drugs, things that we do for cigarettes. Higher taxes and setting aside revenue earned from alcohol for social education, de-addiction, community support, etc. You'll find this article on page number 13 in today's The Hindu. Dutch PM apologizes for 250 years of slavery, calls it a crime against humanity. The Dutch Prime Minister has officially apologized for 250 years of Netherlands' involvement in slavery. He has unequivocally called it crime against humanity. The officials and the Prime Minister have been on visit to 7 former colonies in the South America. And they are going to organize an event where slavery will be condemned and the freedom of the descendant would be celebrated. In this context, I give you a case study from the perspective of ethics paper. Dutch Prime Minister has officially apologized for 250 years of Netherlands' involvement in slavery, calling it a crime against humanity. Government of Canada previously made a formal apology in the House of Commons for the Komagata incident that happened way back in 1914. You must have heard and read about it. Such acts of apologies are not very rare in recent times, and government have been apologizing for the historical wrongs that they committed in the past. Even the government of Australia has apologized to the Aboriginals. Now, the question that you must deal with: discuss the ethical dimensions of forgiveness. Should heinous crimes against humanity be forgiven or should they be compensated? Why apology is considered as a sign of weakness by many, and give some philosophical basis for forgiveness. It's a simple case without much narrative. You have four simple questions. So, the ethical dimension of forgiveness. Forgiveness, first of all, is one's conscious decision of releasing feelings of resentment or vengeance towards a person or a group who has harmed him or her, regardless of whether they actually deserve the pardon. That is the virtue of forgiveness. What happens on immediate basis when someone asks for forgiveness and the person is ready to grant forgiveness is that there is sense of justice. Justice is the most important value in any social structure. The first value mentioned in the preamble is justice. Aristotle has said that it is in justice that the ordering of society is centered. Without sense of justice, there can be no peace in the society. It is only when justice is served in society, people have the sense of justice. It is shown that there is respect for human life. Human beings, they are being treated in a dignified manner. Because on individual level, the most important value that anyone seek for is dignity. After the basic need of human beings are fulfilled, you have food, shelter, clothing, companionship. Everyone wants dignity. No relationship can survive for long without dignity. And when the person feels dignified, he or she is in the position to give a sense of closure, to end dissatisfaction. And that slowly takes away the dissonance from people. When a person forgives, of course, the memory doesn't go away, but we get ready to move into the future. It helps us to stop being the prisoner of the past and grab the opportunity that lies in the future. Australian government have apologized for violence, discrimination against the Aboriginals, and now they are better placed with more social capital to integrate the Aboriginals in the process of governance. And when that happens, also an end comes to intergenerational perpetuation of violence. People in the war prone areas who get affected by violence, the next generation, they feel disgruntled, unsatisfied. They feel discriminated, they have relative sense of deprivation. So those negative emotions that can also include hate, one can overcome only by apology and forgiveness. Only then we can think of the virtues mentioned in the preamble: fraternity, brotherhood, tolerance. Only then we can have humility, empathy, compassion, and all these things will bind us towards unity. Then we can look forward for national cohesion. And this phenomena, operational at individual, social, and national level, also holds true at international level. At international level, if you want ethics to operate in international relation, if you want international peace to get established, there has to be reconciliation for the past wrong. For any kind of rapprochement, the political parties, they must improve their image. And how do you improve your image for your past wrong? Simply by asking for forgiveness. Forgiveness is also self-serving. It improves the soft power, it improves the reputation, it improves the rapport, it develops more social capital. It's a known fact that more Sikhs are giving service as minister in Justin Trudeau cabinet than in India. That's because the government of Canada has wholeheartedly asked for forgiveness to the Sikh community for the Komagata Maru incident. And that has removed the barrier, the psychological barrier that has created warmth in the relation. Government has developed social capital. People are not disgruntled, they don't feel dissatisfied or relatively deprived. They actively participate in the process of governance. The one who seeks for forgiveness, his self respect and dignity is also boosted. It takes courage to ask for forgiveness. It takes intellectual humility to accept one's past wrong. It requires immense application of emotional intelligence to be self aware, to know what wrong you have done or your ancestors have done, to be socially aware, to understand the mental state of others, to have empathy. Operating emotional intelligence in you is not an easy task. You require values of courage, you require emotional intelligence, you require virtue of honesty. Immanuel Kant has said, honesty, truthfulness, it boosts self-respect and dignity. You also feel honored. In the personal sphere, interpersonal relation improves by asking for forgiveness and also forgiving others in the personal relation. Should heinous crimes against humanity be forgiven or should they be compensated? See, all the damages done in the past cannot be compensated. But compensation will of course provide immediate relief. It can complement to the apology. For example, we accepted the historical wrong done to the backward classes and agreed to give reservation in job and in higher educational institutions. So that's a compensation for the past wrong. Compensation can be done depending on the capacity of the country, but more than that, what's required is change in attitude of people. That will come when you have emotional understanding of the situation. You feel or at least understand how others feel. You have the correct information with you. You exactly know what losses, damages others have suffered in hands of you or your ancestor, so that the future behavior becomes ethical. Why apology is considered as a sign of weakness by many? Many considers that apology is acceptance of wrongdoing. Having a wrong policy, a wrong legislation, wrong understanding, wrong decision. And this will expose the lack of expertise and wisdom of individuals and the government. This will also indirectly declare them weak and incapable, not fit to govern. Many become ego defensive. They don't want to change their attitude. They are bereft of the concept of intellectual humility. You see, even Supreme Court allows for curative petition to correct its wrong judgment. Human beings can go wrong, and accepting and honestly working on your mistake will only alleviate you morally, boosting your dignity, self-respect. You must know certain philosophy by some philosophers, moral thinkers, some of their quotations on forgiveness. Gandhiji has said that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. He also said, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of strong. Kant has said it is a duty to be forgiving. It is also a duty to develop a virtue that involves overcoming the vice of malice. It's a duty of virtue to overcome the vice of malice. Malice is opposite to sympathy. So it is a duty of a moral agent of Immanuel Kant to be forgiving. Socrates also had his opinion on forgiveness. He said to understand all is to forgive all. And so the closer we get to wisdom, I believe the more forgiving we become. His idea was human beings do not knowingly do wrong things. So when you understand the other's state of mind, if you have that emotional intelligence and cognitively also you're developed, then you will understand that people will do wrong things out of ignorance. And when they seek forgiveness, you will be prepared to forgive them. Nelson Mandela said, forgiveness liberates the soul. It removes the fear. Forgiveness is also self-serving. He further says that's why it is such a powerful weapon. For 27 years, he was in jail. And when he came out, he didn't take it out on the white masters. He became the president. If he wanted, he could. But he didn't. He forgave them all. And that's how he was able to develop a stable nation like South Africa. Forgiveness does not change the past, but it does enlarge the future. Now, you can add certain philosophy from real politic philosophers as well, like St. Augustine. You can write the concept of Machiavelli or Nensky. Some of them do not consider forgiveness to be a virtue. They may also have the opinion that forgiveness could be the sign of weakness. But largely, in my opinion, we should go by these philosophies. There is an article in today's newspaper contextualizing Ambedkar's idea of a moral democracy. There has been many studies on Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's conceptualization of democracy, predominantly explained through the lens of social, political, and economic philosophies. Here in this article, the authors are trying to situate morality in Dr. Ambedkar's discourse of democracy. So basically, they are discussing how a moral foundation paved the way for Dr. Ambedkar's discourse on democracy. Dr. Ambedkar strongly believed that democracy is always changing in its form and is always in flux. He believed that modern democracy not only places a check on an autocratic rule, but also brings about the welfare of people. He defined democracy as a form and a method of government whereby revolutionary changes in the economic and social life of the people are brought about without bloodshed. This is his definition of democracy. For the successful functioning of such democracy, he puts forward certain conditions. Like there must not be any glaring inequality in the society, and there must not be any oppressed class. There must not be a class that has got all the privileges and a class that has got all the burdens to carry. If we test this criteria in the post pandemic world, we are experiencing increasing socio-economic inequalities, which are making democratic nations not a moral democracy. Dr. Ambedkar suggested that democracy means veto power. Elections act as a periodic veto in which people vote out government, and the opposition in parliament act as an immediate veto. And that curbs the autocratic tendencies of the government in power. But worldwide, it is observed that there has been a trend of weakening of opposition, which consequentially results in weakening of democracy. Dr. Ambedkar also put forward the condition for functioning of a democracy to be this: parliamentary democracy must develop a passion for liberty. When there is liberty or autonomy, only then the rights of people can be fulfilled, and only then the basic human need of dignity can be guaranteed. Dr. Ambedkar wanted parliamentary democracy to develop a passion for liberty to express one's thought, one's opinion, liberty to lead a respectful life, liberty to do what one values. But you see, on Human Freedom Index, India has been sliding down. And this is happening parallelly with weakening of opposition, sliding of Press Freedom Index, deterioration in the general democratic credentials. Dr. Ambedkar also said there must be equality in law and administration. Like should be treated likely, and there should be no discrimination based on class, caste, gender, race, and so on. Dr. Ambedkar brought forward the idea of constitutional morality. For him, the constitution didn't just contain only the legal skeleton, but the flesh is what he calls constitutional morality. And you would know that in the ethics paper this year, UPSC asked about constitutional morality. Dr. Ambedkar's idea of constitutional morality can be summed up like this: constitutional morality is marked by self restraint. Self restraint by whom? Self restraint by government, by executive. That they give up the temptation of going into the gray areas. They don't attempt changing the provisions of constitution just to find a way through. That is self restraint, and that is the foundation of constitutional morality. Then you have other elements of respect for pluralism, skepticism about the authoritative claims to popular sovereignty. Just because a nation has a sovereign authority, it doesn't mean that it can do anything. The natural rights and human rights that must also be respected along with the legal rights and the national rights. And there must be open culture of criticism. Now, if you look at each one of them, they have values ingrained in them. And this is the idea of democracy of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in his moral discourse. On front page, you have the article COP15 Summit Adopts Historic Biodiversity Deal. See the 15th Conference of Parties Summit, COP15 for CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. The member nations, the parties, they have adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This Global Biodiversity Framework is held parallel with the Paris Agreement. As Paris Agreement is for climate change, Global Biodiversity Framework is considered for biodiversity conservation. For the reasons that Paris Agreement has targets, it aspires for financial mechanisms, and such characteristics are also there in Global Biodiversity Framework. And for the first time, a framework on biodiversity of this scale with funding mechanism has been achieved. 95% of parties to CBD, they have agreed on 4 overarching goals and 23 targets. The 4 overarching goals of Global Biodiversity Framework are these: maintaining, enhancing, or restoring the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems, halting human-induced extinction of threatened species and reducing the extinction rate and the risk of all species, maintaining genetic diversity within the population of wild and domesticated species, suitably using and managing biodiversity, and valuing nature's contribution to people. These are general overarching goals. Within the bound of these goals, there are 23 targets. And these are important for you to note. Some of the important targets are here: protecting at least 30% of the world's land, water, coastal, and marine areas by the year 2030. There's also a target of restoring at least 30% of degraded terrestrial, inland, coastal, and marine ecosystem. The parties have put on themselves the target of eliminating the loss of areas with high biodiversity importance, cutting global food waste in half, and reducing overconsumption on waste. There's a mechanism to monitor all these targets. That's why this time it makes more sense and has given more satisfaction. There's a target to reduce the use of pesticide and hazardous chemicals by half by 2030. And to this point, India raised certain concern because India has large agricultural areas, and in developing countries, use of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and other chemicals are common. Because of high population density, agricultural productivity has to be kept high, and these chemicals becomes important in that context because we do not have intensive agriculture. Farm mechanization is low, so productivity many a times is enhanced by these chemicals. It remains to be seen as to what stand government of India will finally take on this and how India plans to fulfill this target. There's also a target of phasing out or reforming subsidies that harm biodiversity by at least 500 billion USD per year. Perhaps the most important target that has come out is mobilizing at least USD 200 billion for funding from all sources for biodiversity related causes. And just like climate change negotiations, it has been agreed upon that developed countries have to share the greater burden of responsibility. So there has been agreement of increasing international financial flows to developing countries to at least 20 billion USD per year by 2025 and at least 30 billion USD per year by 2030. This kind of financial mechanism has never been evolved in biodiversity conservations. It has been made an obligation on the developed nation to ensure the financial flow to developing nations. There's also a target for preventing the introduction of invasive species and reducing the establishment of known or potential invasive species. It's also important for you to note that large and transnational companies will have to disclose their risks and impact on biodiversity. This is also a very commendable target that the parties have set. The COP15 summit is a hard work of 2 years. Back in 2020, the summit was to be held in Kunming in China, but because of the pandemic, the meetings was held in part, but it could not come all through. So the same has been continued in Montreal in Canada. So it's also called as Kunming-Montreal Agreement. In the coming days, you will get to read more articles on it. The articulation of the targets and how Government of India plans to fulfill the targets, that will become more clear. So as and when the analysis keeps coming, you'll keep getting that in the DNS.